This is Macdonald Scott. And Macdonald used to be an assistant for me here in my home. He used to do a lot of amazing work. And that was maybe 20 years ago or more. Now, an immigration consultant, I gather with a law firm and helping people come into Canada here in Toronto.
I think it was 91 we worked together. 91 when I was lucky enough to work with Peace Magazine.
Tell me about your job, Mac. What is it you do?
Largely people who are already in Canada trying to get status. I do a lot of activist work with a group called No One Is Illegal, which is a migrant justice group. And so some of my legal work is geared towards supporting their members and the people they work with. I also work a lot with a group called the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. So a lot of my clients are actually from shelters, homeless shelters. Also, I work with a couple of women's shelters, so women survivors of domestic violence, and try and help them to get their immigration status. Try and help them to stay here. Also, trying to make Canada's immigration policies more equitable.
Oh, I'm not at all surprised, because at the time you were working here, you struck me as a very idealistic and very thoughtful and kind person.
I work for a very idealistic and thoughtful employer.
Okay, tell me about that.
I work with a law firm for my paid work, but very much overlaps with my social justice work and my advocacy for migrant justice. I work for a multi-ethnic firm called Carenza LLP, started by Canada's first Latin American lawyer, so the first Latin American person to get past the bar and to become a lawyer, Juan Carenza, who is also very well known, especially in Spanish-speaking communities, does amazing community work himself, has fought for social justice and revolution in El Salvador for 30-odd years, fled here because of the civil war in El Salvador, and the firm is by and large migrants themselves. And I'm lucky enough to work with Juan, and he lets me do migrant justice advocacy and organizing as part of my job. On an average day, I might go to a women's shelter, meet with some clients. I might go to a homeless shelter like Seton House and meet with clients. I may go to one of the places where I do clinics. So we do clinics at different community health centers, different shelters, different community organizations. I'm doing one with people from No One's Illegal on Sunday with a group out at Weston and Lawrence who are affiliated with the Workers' Action Center. And we'll go and I'll answer people's legal questions. I'm licensed, so I can actually give immigration law advice and do representation. So I'll go and I'll meet with people. I'll meet with clients. I might have a hearing. I might have to go in front of the Immigration Refugee Board. Or the Canadian immigration system is very complicated. You can have status, you can have partial status, you can have permanent residency. It's very much like a pyramid with citizenship on the top and people without any status on the bottom. Much like much of our society, it's very much a hierarchical pyramid. So we largely work with the people at the bottom. Sorry.
How do these people get here, for the most part? You're talking about people who are considered, as you say, illegal. I love the title of this organization, No One Is Illegal. It's beautiful. But there are some people who are considered illegal, right? And how did they get into Canada in the first place?
You have people who have status, even permanent residency, and then lose it, usually because of a criminal conviction, but sometimes because of other reasons. There's a variety of reasons.
When you say they have status, that means that they're on record someplace as intending to stay. Is that it?
Well, they have legal, so they have status, like means that they have some form of legal paperwork that says they're allowed to stay. So it would be on record. It'd be within our immigration system, the computer system. It would be that they usually have a piece of paper that says they have a form of status. And people come and they lose their status. They stay here to take care of their sick mom, and they can't, at some point immigration says, well, you can't stay anymore. They come here as a worker, they get abused by their employer, and then they can't find a new employer, so they lose their work permit. As I said before, they do a refugee claim and they lose it, even though it may be a very legitimate refugee claim. Our immigration system is very broken. It
Hmm.
falls, unfortunately, on the lines of much of how Canada's policy falls. It's very based on class and race. People coming from the global south have a much harder time than people coming from Europe or the United States. Uh, Gays, lesbians, trans people, bisexuals, intersex have a really hard time. Women are often, like fleeing domestic violence, are treated very badly. So the state, in their view, says you don't have status, but often it's a very complicated story as to how someone gets there.
Okay, how do they get? Let's say somebody comes to the Peace Bridge in Buffalo,
Yeah.
or to Pearson Airport. In the first place, to have arrived by plane, somebody in the airplane industry must have said to not just here's a ticket, but also show me that you
Yes.
are allowed to go into Canada, right? I
Yes.
don't know what they expect in order to even sell them a ticket. Or let's say they're driving across the bridge and they get to the bridge, and the guy says, where are you going and why? And what do they say then? Most of those people would have said, I'm going to Toronto for a visit and I don't have any intention to stay, but I'm just here for fun. And do they let them in on that basis? What would they say to them then?
It really depends. There's certain countries where you need a visa to come to Canada. Uh, Most other countries, other than the United States, you need what's called electronic travel authorization, which is an online application. In both those situations, they're going to look at whether they think you're going to come and stay or you're going to come and work without papers. And by and large, unfortunately, depending on which part of the world you're from, again, it's a very racist system. If you're flying in Guatemala City at the Canadian consulate there and you don't have a lot of money, chances are you've been turned down for a visa. The airline has to check whether you have proper authorization to come to Canada. And if they don't, and you come and you stay, then or make a refugee claim, then they will be fined for the amount of the airfare to fly you back. So they do check. They often don't know what they're doing. An example in hand would be my client whose 3 children fleeing domestic violence kept being turned down by the airline, even though they had their mother was a refugee in Canada on the basis of this guy who had been abusing her, who was their father, and the airline kept refusing them, and eventually we got them here. They don't know what they're doing, but if they let someone in, the person stays, they will be fined. So they're very overly zealous about making sure that people have the right paperwork before getting on the plane. At the Peace Bridge, if you come here, let's say you come here and you have family here, and you're fleeing Iran because of violence in Iran, and you make it to the Canadian side of the border, and you say, I'm going to make a refugee claim. I'm in danger in Iran. I have a brother here in Canada. They will let you stay and do a refugee claim. If you don't have someone here, what they're going to do is they're going to turn you around, send you back to the States and say, make your refugee claim in the United States. Now, the United States asylum program, which is like their refugee program, has a lot of major problems. So what a lot of people do is they will go down to Roxham Road between Quebec and New York City, and they will walk across. And then once you're on Canadian soil, because of the UN Convention on Refugees, the Geneva Convention, Canada has an obligation to let you do a refugee claim. The convention was passed 1951, right after the Second World War, and most nations in the world signed on to it. And what it says is if someone on your soil says they're in danger in their country of origin, you have to have some kind of reasonably fair process to decide and can't send them back. What's called refoulement. You can't refoul them to their country of origin. You can't send them back if they're in danger. Mm-hmm. So Canada's obligated by international law to then have the person have a refugee hearing.
Of course, I don't hear very much about Canadian law on this, but almost every day nowadays, I'm hearing stuff about the U.S. and what Trump plans to do. And I had thought that most of what the U.S. should do or is allowed to do is already determined by international law, that the regulations would limit the number of things that he can do to curtail the flow of people uh, from, obviously he's worried about the southern border of the U.S. more than he seems to be worried about other parts. But to what extent does international law make all the difference about these things?
Well,
Does it really limit what he can do? Because he seems to be able to make up the law as he goes along.
in basic legal principles, if a country has ratified an international instrument, you know this, you're the first one that taught me about international law, but if a country has ratified it, it is considered to be basically part of their domestic law. So, for example, both Canada and the United States have ratified the Geneva Convention, the United Convention on Refugees, the United Nations Convention on Refugees.
Mm-hmm.
That is considered part of their domestic law. So if they're breaking it, they're basically breaking their own law. Now, Donald Trump doesn't hold much with this. I believe a lot of what he's doing, particularly the Turn Back program, where if you're coming up through Mexico and you make an asylum claim in the United States, you have to go back to Mexico to wait out the asylum claim. That very much breaches the Geneva Convention.
That's it. Because he's forcing people to stay in Mexico. But if they land in the U.S. and get their feet on U.S. soil, that does not automatically mean they get to stay. He can throw them back.
Yeah, and then they have to do their, as I understand it, then they have to wait out their asylum claim while in Mexico. That completely breaches the whole idea of refoulement, which is that you can't send someone out of your country when they're potentially in danger in their country of origin, where they came from.
Okay.
So he is very much breaching international law. Now, I know there's a really good project in the United States called the National Immigration Project. It's part of the National Lawyers Guild, which is like a left-wing lawyers, legal workers, law students, and jailhouse lawyers organization. I used to work with them. They're definitely challenging this. The problem is what he's going to do is he's going to keep doing his malicious assault on refugees, his malicious assaults on migrants, until it winds its way through the courts. And as we all know, it all depends who's in those courts, right? Like every government tries to change the Supreme Court here and in the US to be more within their political purview. They use it as a way of rewarding patronage. And, so as the Supreme Court in the United States becomes more and more conservative, they're less and less likely to rule in accordance with international law. I mean, and that's a fact that the same border that he's defending, huge chunks of the United States were Mexico before the United States invaded them. So it's really, a lot of these borders are just figments of politicians and, moneyed interests, imaginations.
Mm-hmm.
And they will go to all extent to defend them. But you're talking about, borders that are dividing people who were communities and families for centuries. And it just, I don't even think it just runs afoul of international law. It runs afoul of like human morality to say that someone can't join their family in Texas or come to Texas or New Mexico, areas that were long part of Mexico long before the United States actually took them over.
Mm-hmm. Are some of the people, I presume some, but are many of the people that you work with people from Latin American countries that have been trying to get into the U.S. and unable to make it, or trying some other angle because of the difficulty in the U.S., or is it really that different? Is it much harder to get into the U.S. than it is into Canada? We have an impression, I think, Justin Trudeau has allowed us to think that, at any rate, that Canada is a really generous and kindly country that welcomes people of all backgrounds and all situations. So how true is it? How much difference is there between the U.S. and Canada, let's say?
Canada, the United States is actually generally easier to get a visa to. There are many tens hundreds of times as many people coming into the US on a given day than Canada. And Canada is actually quite a difficult country to get a visa to. We claim to have a very generous refugee system, but to be honest, the stat that always comes to mind is that Lebanon, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia take over millions of refugees, or have millions of refugees living within their borders. Canada takes overseas refugees about 20,000. So that's refugees that Canada agrees goes into camps through the UN High Commission on Refugees and says, we'll take this family, they can come to Canada. Or we'll set them up with a group of Canadians to sponsor them, or a church or a mosque to sponsor them to come to Canada. And we take a fraction of the world's refugees. By and large, the world refugee problem, and we have a huge amount of people on the move. We have wars, we have economics, the fact that so much of the global south has been put in debt to the global north has caused people to flee for the same reasons that my grandparents fled, which was to try and make a better way of life for their children. We have growing amounts of people coming because of environmental disasters. So the flooding of Bangladesh, the tsunamis in Japan a number of years ago, those become reasons for people to try and come here. And to be honest, getting to Canada in the first place is very difficult. And once you get here, despite what Justin Trudeau has told us, we do not have a generous nor a giving immigration or refugee system. And I think the example I would say, and my partner, my life partner, sponsored a family from Syria to come here. Two families, actually, one through my son's school and one through the faculty that she teaches with at the university. During that wave of Syrian refugees. So we took 10,000 Syrian refugees in the first year after that terrible, media spot on the dead child washed up on the beach. And, it was a real crisis. That crisis is ongoing. What Trudeau doesn't talk about is that after that year and all the media shots and the shots of him, greeting the families at Pearson, is that quietly one night on Friday night, which is an old political move, do it on a Friday night because the media won't cover it, he cut it down from 10,000 to 1,000. And
10,000 what per what?
10,000 refugees were allowed in the first year from Syria. And quietly overnight, he cut that quota down to 1,000.
And he can do that just boom, like that, without, there's no legislation involved. It's an executive order or something.
It's an order in council.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, cabinet decided it, and it became an order in council, ministerial instruction. And he can do that because the legislation empowers the regulations to do certain things, and then the regulations delegate other things to basically ministerial instructions. And so the cabinet makes a decision, it gets handed down to the minister makes it into an instruction, and it's not law as such, but it basically becomes what happens.
Okay, now 1,000 what? 1,000 people from Syria per year, or what?
Per year.
Really?
So we went from 10,000 to 1,000.
10,000 to 1,000, and there's no discussion about that? Really? And when did this happen? And what would he have given as a reason for that?
Well, he didn't give a lot of reason. He did it quietly. Trudeau's been playing a fine line, and there's been some really good things come out of it, where he's both, especially right now, he's both trying to get the right-wing voters to believe that he's tough on illegal immigrants, so-called illegal immigrants, and at the same time do some good concessions. So, we've had some gains. They're not what we wanted, but around migrant workers who are being abused by their employer. Right now, a migrant worker who's being abused by their employer can apply for a special type of status or an open a work permit to work wherever they want. So that's been a real gain. We've seen some other gains on family sponsorship, that women in abusive situations are being treated more fairly. But at the same time, also last year, he promised 10,000 deportations, and he put a lot more money into immigration enforcement, Canada Border Services Agency. And I work with a lot of those people. They said that it was actually a lot of pressure to suddenly deport all these people. So he's playing like a mixed game, like the liberals often do. He's not ideologically driven in the same way that the Conservative Party is. But at the same time, he's so wishy-washy that it's hard to know what he's actually thinking half the time. And he does still fulfill the mandate of Canadian immigration policy, which is a mandate to keep out poor people of color. Regardless, that's always been the mandate.
Say that again. What? The mandate of the Canadian policy has been to keep out poor people of color?
In the 60s, up until the 60s, Canadian immigration policy had race as an open category around immigration. So prior to that period, immigration policies were quite open. Like my parents-in-law came as working class white people from England and Ireland. And, it wasn't completely easy, but it was fairly easy. Then more and more people of color started coming. Well, in the 60s, human rights case said you can't have race as an open category of immigration. So they took it out because it was unlawful. What they did is they have written race in it as an undercurrent within all immigration policy. So things that look innocuous, like you need to be able to speak English or French, things that look innocuous, like you have to have a certain amount of money to come to Canada, are a way of putting class and race into, in a sublime way, putting class and race into immigration policy. It was only when people of color started coming that we really tightened up our immigration policy. Until the 1920s area, our immigration policy was largely one of encouraging people to come. We were encouraging European and Eastern European farmers to come, to open up the prairies, to open up largely native land. And we were encouraging people to come. Then people of color started coming. So we had like the Kamado Amaru, where all the Sikh World War I veterans came to Vancouver and were held in their boat offshore while many of them died of starvation and disease, and then sent back because they were people of color. We had race riots.
That particular incident, I'm not familiar with.
I'm not sure about the date. I think it was the late 1910s. But what it was Canada passed a policy called the continuous passage. Canada didn't want people coming from South Asia. So rather than saying that openly, what Canada said is you can only immigrate to Canada if you come via one boat. So not a boat that stops anywhere along the way. Because Canada knew that there were no direct boats from India and South Asia. A group of Sikh World War II or World War I veterans organized their own boat to come to Canada to try and get around this. When it got to Canada, it was held off by the Navy in the bay in Vancouver. They were refused food for a time until it got apparent that this was really problematic. They were refused medical attention for a time until it became obviously problematic. A lot of them died, and then eventually Canada sent the boat back. And that's not, even more recently, we had boat people landing in Victoria about 6, 7, 8 years ago, and they were held in the military base and eventually sent back. We've sent Tamils that have come on boats back in scores. It's the protectionist system, very much based on race and class.
Again, this is not something I would have known, mostly because, the streets of Toronto are very full of people from Asia. And I think probably not as much from Latin American countries. I think probably fewer from Africa, around the Mediterranean, Syria, and all of the countries from the new Arab Spring, wars and so on, that those people have a harder time getting here. I don't meet any anyway. So what's the situation in terms of ethnic distribution?
I don't know the actual numbers. I think you're right. There are a lot of people from Asia. I think a lot of what happens is when people have a base community here, when you establish a community, it helps. People bring their families, that kind of thing. All I know is that the system is still, even though it may not appear otherwise, still very restrictive. I know that, for example, we used to have a very open definition of what family was in terms of who you could bring in your family, much less based on the European idea of a family, which is, you have the nuclear family with the two children, two parents, the children, the grandparents, and so on and so forth. You used to be able to bring your uncle, your aunt, your cousin, anybody that you were close to that you wanted to bring. Was more liberal in those terms back about 20 years ago, and that was changed. I know that what I see in the detention centers is that a lot of Black immigrants are being detained. By and large, the majority of the immigrants I work with in detention are Black. And I know that for Latin American immigrants, Spanish-speaking migrants, that there was some fairly progressive programs during the revolutionary wars in Guatemala and El Salvador in the 70s and 80s, which allowed, and Chile, which allowed migrants or refugees to come, but that right now it's extremely hard to come from anywhere in South or Central America or Mexico, though I do have a lot of Mexican clients. And thankfully, Trudeau did get rid of the visa requirement for Mexicans. What you have, though, is you have a system that by and large still makes it much easier if you're middle class or rich, and much easier if you're from Europe or the United States. And that's the way the system has always been. Now, that said, we are lucky to live in a beautiful, diverse city. And that's thankfully because a lot of people from migrant communities fought to come and have fought to try and change the laws. And the laws are always in flux between one way and the other because of people's organizing and people's work. But, there's still a baseline of restriction, especially around people of color.
Trump was making his most outrageous public statements about, Mexicans as rapists coming to, and maybe one or two of them might be good people. That kind of comment, and then turning people away and keeping all these families in terrible situations on the southern border of the U.S. Some people said, why doesn't Canada say, come on up here. If you can't get into the U.S., we'll have somebody help you come to Canada. I think my impression is that a hell of a lot of Canadians would support that. The beautiful thing about Canada, if there's any beauty in what you're describing as a rather serious situation, the beautiful thing is that most people, I think, are actually hospitable to, maybe more hospitable than the government is, to immigration. Most of us feel good about the fact that we are a diverse society and that Canada is, well, we like to think, a more generous and welcoming host to immigrants than other people. So there must be political pressure from some source in Canada that is not all that visible. People don't speak up that much saying, we've got to keep out these guys. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right. I think the majority of people who live in Canada welcome people coming. I think other than obviously Indigenous people, we're all from migrant stock. And, there's some understanding that people need to come here, that our economy, our society needs people to come, that it helps where we live both culturally and economically and in terms of building our communities. But what I do think, I think one thing is that I don't think people, and fair enough, people are working, they have families, they have lives. I don't think people are really aware of how Canada immigration policy works. I think our government has managed to paint it as like a rosy picture. People aren't aware of the history. When we started doing work around immigration detention, by and large, a lot of the people we spoke to outside of the communities we were working in weren't aware that Canada detained immigrants, weren't aware that people were being held, sometimes indefinitely, 10, 12 years for the purposes of being deported. When we told people this, they got really upset because they thought it was, nasty, which it is. And then I think the other thing is, yes, there are clear interests. I think we have large companies that are getting money to build immigration detention centers. We have employers who are using non-documented labor as a way of basically exploiting them and taking their labor for almost free, sometimes for even more than free. We have agencies that help people to come to Canada that basically exploit them on the way. We have an economy that's by and large not the United States economy is really dependent on undocumented non-status labor, but large chunks of our economy are dependent on non-status labor or laborers like the live-in caregiver program or the in-home caregiver program, where people have less than normal rights, like the seasonal agricultural program, where workers have less than normal rights. Our economy also depends on this exploitation of labor. And so, yeah, you have employers that are invested in this exploitation, that you also have, hate groups right now. They're organizing, like the Gita Sons of Odin, who are influencing the national debate in so much as, Scheer, our potential prime minister, has spoken at rallies around this stuff that are instilling hate. And there is a part of the population that buys into this hate speech, that buys into this, idea that newcomers to Canada are less than Canadian. We passed a truck today on the highway that had a Canadian flag sticker that said "fit in" or "FUCK off." There is a chunk of the population that is openly xenophobic, openly racist, and they unfortunately right now are having more and more influence, which is why groups like the Migrant Rights Network nationally are organizing against hate and justice for migrants, because we can't let this growing culture of hate that's coming up both in Canada, the States, and Europe, we can't let it win. We need to go back to basic human values and towards building communities that we can all live in safely and as valued members.
In general, when the government changes from a conservative government to a liberal government, or let's hope one day a very progressive government, is this really reflected in the actual numbers and situation of people arriving in Canada or trying to come to Canada? Do you see a real change in policy as a conservative regime takes over or steps aside?
I mean, I come from a group that's not supportive of any party. Our job is to fight for our people, which is for migrants. So I see like the larger, or at least I believe I see, maybe I don't, but the larger picture of like how Canadian immigration policy is built. But that said, I mean, when we were fighting around detention issues, which has been a large passion of mine for the last, 15, 20 years, immigration detention, the Conservatives wouldn't even meet with us. We had 191 very brave men who were on hunger strike, some to the point of like, permanent damage. And the Conservatives would just send in low-level flunkies to meet with them. When the Liberals came in, and I don't want to give them too many kudos, but they would actually meet with the movement. And to their credit, they did make some short-sighted, not what we wanted, changes to immigration detention, which has made it much more reasonable and fair. I don't know who I'm going to vote for in the next election, or if I'm going to vote at all, but you can definitely dialogue more clearly with Liberals. Certainly, when we organize, we can actually pressure them much more. The Conservatives tend to put up more of a wall, and I fear that it's a different period even than Harper right now, right? Like Harper was largely driven by a neoliberal agenda. So it was like liberalize trade, certainly shore up borders so that labor can't move as easily as labor should be able to move, as a way of keeping people in exploitive situations. But it wasn't driven by the same kind of movements of hate. And I know that Scheer is influenced by these new hate movements that are rising up. And it's something different than neoliberalism. It's almost like a turn so far to the right, so far towards hate. Mm-hmm. And what I worry is that if Scheer gets in, we're going to really see that come out in his policies.
Okay.
I don't know
who. Yeah. Well, and another more general question. First is, one is, what? Tell me about this detention center business. Who gets held in detention and why, and where, and how long, and how come I don't know anything about it?
Well, It's been an unknown topic for a long time. Back 6, 7 years ago, this 191 people in a correctional center in Lindsay, Ontario, small little, beautiful little town actually. Beautiful, terrible, terrible big jail built by Harris during the Harris period, one of his super jails. There was basically 191 people being held on immigration detention. The reason they're held is that they don't have status in Canada. They're allegedly removable. They can be removed from Canada. And for whatever reason, Canada's decided that they're not likely to show up for an interview or that they're a danger to the public. And what it comes down to in real facts is that they're almost all Black. And I mean, I think there's been plenty of evidence in the media that Black people get treated very differently by our justice system, as do Indigenous people, than other folk. So often you've got a Black person who's been targeted by the criminal justice system, has gone through it for whatever reason, has pled guilty to a charge they may or may not have been guilty to. Legal representatives have not looked into the immigration consequences, and they've lost their status. So they're supposed to be removed. Now, it doesn't happen as much recently, I have to be honest with you, but back when we were first working this, I had a client, Michael Mavogo. He's been in the media. He can be easily looked up. And he was held 10 years. He had been arrested for carrying a small amount of cocaine. He didn't have immigration status. They detained him. His country of origin would not issue a travel document. At one point, Canada Border Services Agency, and again, this is documented. This is in the media. This is in the Toronto Star. But Canada Border Services Agency basically agreed to buy a fraudulent document to deport him. They got him to his country of origin, the Gambia, and they said this is a fake document. They detained the 2 immigration officers who were accompanying him abroad and him.
2 Canadians who took him back to his home country.
Yes, it was Canadian immigration officers who went with him to escort him to his home country. They were detained. They eventually, the Department of Foreign Affairs got involved. There was a whole dialogue, and eventually they were released and they were all sent back to Canada. But this was the kind of thing that was going on. We had clients who were being detained.
The client was sent back with the
immigration officer. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
They were also detained.
Well, it sounds like the Gambians had more sense than the Canadians did.
Yes, they did. So, I mean, that was the situation we were dealing with in those days. That happens less, but I mean, I still have a client who's been detained, at this point it'd be a year. And, you know, people shouldn't be detained, period, for immigration reasons.
How often are people detained? I mean, I didn't know there really was such a thing. Oh, I guess I could have guessed there might be, but surely it's not a big deal. Are there many people? What fraction of all the people coming as well, I don't want to use the word illegal, but the people who would be considered illegal, what fraction of them would actually be held in that way?
It's not a huge number. There are a lot of people held overnight. You can be held overnight for the purposes of examination. Let's say I get to Pearson International and I say I'm in danger, I need to do a refugee claim. And they don't have enough officers on staff at that time. So they need to hold off my interview till tomorrow. I'll generally be detained. There's an immigration holding center out on Rexdale Boulevard that's near the airport that holds, I believe it's about 150 people. And right now it's not as bad as it used to be, but it's often full. There's another one in Laval, Quebec that's now being expanded to hold more people. There's another one in Surrey, British Columbia that's being expanded to hold more people. In a given year, Canada detains around 6,630 odd immigrants. Now, it used to be that we had hundreds. We used to have 600 or 700 that were being held long-term. So that's defined usually as 6 months or more. It's less now. It's maybe, I don't know the stats. They're actually on this CBSA website now, thanks to the struggle that the people inside put up. The immigration enforcement is being much more transparent. But I believe we hold maybe a couple of hundred that are, in the 6 months or more category. But we still hold them. And the fact is that immigration law, by and large, there are sections of immigration law that are basically criminal law. So like if I traffic you into Canada, that's a criminal offense. But people who come without status, it's an administrative offense. It's the equivalent of like a serious parking ticket. We don't jail people in Canada for parking tickets, but we jail them because they don't come with status. And I think we need to look at this. And Metta, you're not. There's no fault on you. Everyone I talk to, my family, I've worked on this for a good 20 years. But my family, my community, people aren't aware of this. But there are people being held because they just came without the right piece of paper. And I just don't believe that that's right, that should happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think we need to look into the fact that by and large, the majority of them are Black and almost all of them are people of color. Like that's just something's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You don't have to work hard to convince me of that.
No, I didn't think so.
Tell me about the inequalities in the regular quota system, or the way we accept, the grounds on which we accept people in the normal process of immigration, or of maybe working here and not coming to immigrate. For example, I go through Forest Hill on my way home from downtown and driving. And people, there are generally women pushing baby strollers, and they're all from Philippines, it looks like.
Yes.
Many of these women are nannies living in people's homes. And I understand that there's a program whereby women in the Philippines in particular have a habit of accepting a situation where they come to Canada and work as a caregiver, either for children or in somebody's maybe sick person's or old person's home, and then maybe they can get immigration status for that. I don't know. What is that? On the other hand, I've heard of people who in effect buy their way in. I think I hear it mostly with regard to Vancouver, that people from China or someplace come and if you can invest a certain amount of money, like a few $1 million on a business, it's easy to get immigration status, because we want people who are going to come and bring their money to Canada. And that you don't have to jump through the same hoops that other people do in order to get to come. So to what extent would considerations of that kind be involved with many of the people that you know?
So I've had the honor of working a lot with the caregiver community. Particularly, there's a really good group called Caregivers Action Center, which has been around for a number of years, and was organized a bit originally and still is by caregivers themselves. The caregiver program was first an actual treaty between the Philippines. What you're seeing is actually what's going on. So the caregiver program was a program organized between the Philippines and Canada. At one point under Marcos, the wonderful dictator in the Philippines boasted that their main export to Canada was women. And what it was a program to bring Philippine women in without their families, without their own children, to live in Canada and take care of our children, our people with disabilities, older people, elderly. Mm-hmm. And originally it was you would come, you would live in the home, you would have a work permit which was dependent on that employer. And if you did anything wrong, or the employer got rid of you, or the employer died, you went back. Mm-hmm. Caregivers organized. It's one of the best organized communities I've worked with, actually. They organized, and they were able to fight that after 2 years, they could get permanent residency. That was a big gain, and that was done by women taking to the streets. They also expanded the program around this a little earlier than that to also the Caribbean. And now, of course, it's open to the entire world, anybody who qualifies. But by and large, it's still Caribbean or Philippine women. And they were able to get permanent residency. Now, there was a number of different problems, some of which have gotten better, but there's still problems. One was that you couldn't bring your family. So I've worked with women who they've been apart from their children for 4 years while waiting for their permanent residency. Because the only time
but after they get permanent residency, they're treated like anybody else. They can bring
children.
Yeah,
their children can come. But they're still, 4 years. I have a 14-year-old, and some days I'd like to be apart from him, but most days
know the feeling.
And I certainly wouldn't want to be apart from him for 4 years. I can't imagine how heartbreaking that is. Mm-hmm. Well, I can from a little bit from what I hear from the people I work with. Mm. But the other problem was that this sets up extremely exploitive situations. So I've had clients who've gone through sexual abuse, physical abuse at the hands of the employer. If they complain on the employer calls immigration on them. Even if the employer doesn't call immigration on them, or they're able to do a police case and stay here, they don't have the hours that they need to get their permanent residency. They have to go through a special program to try and get their permanent residency. It often doesn't work. It's having someone live in a home with their employer. It can be great, but it also sets up the potential for extremely exploitive situations.
Mm-hmm. Horrible.
Also, having their status dependent on being with that employer sets up extremely exploitive situations. What we've called for, what the Caregivers Action Center has called for, is have the caregivers become permanent residents on arrival. Then they have the same status as anyone is in Canada if they make a labor complaint, if they make a police complaint, if they can't stay with that employer. You could even have conditions that they need to spend 2 years working in the program. They could still bring their kids. Right now, under the Trudeau government, they made some changes that allow, it's some of the good changes they've made in the last 2 months, that allow caregivers to bring their families with them when they come. But you still have to prove that you're earning enough money to support your family. And unfortunately, that's very difficult under the caregiver program because you're usually earning minimum wage, basically. I know the prevailing wage for caregivers is basically at the point of minimum wage. So somehow with that, you have to prove that you can support your partner and your 2 or 3 children or whatever children to come, which is basically impossible. We also, the language benchmarks for caregivers are much higher than any other profession. So like they have to have better French or English than you would have to do a similar job in a different profession. There's still a lot of barriers. It's gotten better under the Liberals, but what the Caregiver Action Center has been calling for is make them permanent residents on arrival.
Mm-hmm. Now then talk about the people who are able to buy their way in by simply saying, I've got $50 million that I can set up a new building or a business, or maybe it's much less than $50 million. What's the situation there? Or is that still the case that people with money who want to invest or find it easier to get immigration status?
So the old program used to be called the Investor. There was 2 programs, the Investor program and the Entrepreneur program. And you proved that you had a certain amount of personal worth, I think it was $800,000, and that you're either willing to, that you're willing to invest $800,000, or that you had a certain amount of personal worth and you're going to start a business in Canada. That's no longer part of our permanent residency program. What the Liberals introduced, though, is the startup program. So if you show that you have a certain personal worth and you're able to start a business up here in Canada, then you can easily get a work permit to come in here to Canada, start that business up, and then basically stay, become a permanent resident once you're here for about a year. So there is an easy backdoor for people with money. It's also just generally easier for people with money to get visas because they want you to show that you have a lot of money, so you will not become a problem with welfare or social services once you get here. And there's just generally programs, like one of the big programs right now is the student visa, which you have to cover foreign student fees. You have to show that you have enough money to survive once you get here. It's really only open to people with a lot of income. So yeah, it's always been easier if you have a lot of income.
Now, I think a year or 2 ago, there was talk in the U.S. of changing the policy. It was considered a retrograde move by progressive Democrats and so on in the U.S. to have the U.S. do less accepting of people for family reunification programs and more based on some sort of point system. And it was pointed out that this is not considered an old-fashioned and antiquated and unfair system in Canada, because Canada already does a lot along those lines, that we accept people on the basis of points of how much education they have, how many they know the language, how well, and other. I've forgotten. I'm an immigrant myself. Was 47 years ago. Can't remember how I got in, but it wasn't that hard. Because I had what would be called points, I think. It's true that Canada actually does recruit people on the basis of the kind of workers we want, or the kinds of citizens that we consider likely to be productive to the economy, and not so much on policies such as family reunification. In other words, if the U.S. accepts more people, or a higher percentage of people on the basis of family reunification, that I'm assuming is considered a more generous policy than picking and choosing the kind of people that you think are going to help your economy. And if Canada is more of the latter, what do you think about that?
So our point system has been around for a long, long time. It probably was around when you came. It was largely used to, when they got rid of race as a category. That was when the point system really came into play in the 60s. So yes, it's based on education, it's based on age, it's based on your income, it's based on your work experience, it's based on whether you have family or connections to Canada, all that stuff. And it's been around for a long time. Family reunification is also a program in Canada. It's been gradually becoming more restrictive with some better changes made by the Liberals, but by and large, it's restricted to your partner and your children. You can bring your parents, but you have to be earning a certain amount of money to bring your parents or your grandparents. To bring anybody else in your family is extremely difficult. They basically have to be the only remaining person in your family. The point system is extremely problematic. The restrictions around language are very much based on trying to keep out people from certain parts of the world. You have to have a certain income. Like, it is very much income-based. I mean, when you look at who is in our communities, who's actually, built our communities, it's by and large working class people doing working class jobs. It's also people doing what we may not even consider work, like taking care of children, taking care of elderly people, doing the arts, all that kind of stuff, which is by and large not recognized in Canadian immigration law. So yeah, it's extremely problematic. And I guess seeing the states, it was introduced as a supposedly fair system because you've got a score and you either won or you didn't. Right now, it's actually a lottery. They do a draw every 3-4 weeks of the top percentage of people in terms of their points. They don't tell you really what that marker is going to be based on. They don't tell you when, the draws are not on a systematic basis. And it's also very much, like you said, geared towards what they consider jobs that Canada needs. So I understand, I don't necessarily agree with, but I understand the rationale around the economic nature of immigration. But I also think we have to look beyond that to what do people need? People need their family. People need sometimes just to come here because they're in danger. People need to be able to come here because they want to build a better life for their family. And that's how most of our communities have been built.
Okay, one last question, and that is really the big picture. It seems to me that with all of the right-wing reaction against immigration and transfer of migrants around the world now, it's really an appalling reaction, a bad development. But I think when you consider what's coming in with global warming and all of these migrations that are going to be required because people's entire homelands are submerged and so on, the transfer of population then is going to be 100 times more challenging than now. If we're already finding people balking at what is probably beneficial transfer of populations today as we accept more people in Canada, and as Europeans probably benefit from having some of these people arrive, then what prospect is there for a more generous and open situation when the time comes for the floods of migration that seem likely to be in the future, not so far in the future?
I mean, I think we have to make choices right now. It's a really rough time. We only have a certain number of years that we can turn back what we have done to this planet. I think we have to look at it globally and realize, like, if Bangladesh gets flooded, of course people are going to leave. So do we start changing our lifestyles? Do we start holding industry to account for the amount of pollution that they create, for the fact that a progress and growth created economy has led us down this merry road of destruction? Or do we hold up in our basements, in our bunkers with our shotguns and our 45s and whatever else we got to try and shoot the next person of color who comes around the corner?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we really need to look at what kind of world do we want to create. And I don't think holding up in that bunker is going to create a world even for the people in the bunker. Eventually they're going to run out of food. Mm-hmm. Eventually, people are going to flood our cities, flood Canada because we have water and there's not going to be any water. And, I don't think I want to be one of those rich people holed up in a bunker on a hill trying to hold off the hordes. I want to be part of the hordes to figure out how we save as many of ourselves and our communities as we can.
And you are indeed exactly that. You are one of those hordes of people trying to save the world. Bless your heart, sweetie.
Yes, just like you, Metta.
It's wonderful to see you again, Mac, and to know that you're doing such true.
You're the one that taught me this, Metta. You're to be held responsible for anything I do.
I love it. I can't think of anybody I'd rather be responsible for the credit of. Bless your heart, dear. You take care, and thanks so much. Go to your demonstration.
Bless you too, Metta.
Hurry. Okay. Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.